Welcome to the new episode of our podcast On the Spot. Today's topic is general election in Bulgaria, just held the last Sunday. And today I have a great honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Mila Moshelova. She is a postdoctoral researcher at Sofia University. She used to be also project coordinator for Bulgaria and North Macedonia at Friedrich Naumann Foundation, also project coordinator for Western Balkans and Turkey at the European Council of Foreign Relations. So welcome and thank you for kindly accepting my invitation.
Thank you, and it's good to be on the podcast.
Thank you again. So I would appreciate if we can start with describing the context in these seventh elections in three years took place in Bulgaria. What is the reason behind such a protracted political instability in Bulgaria?
It is interesting when we hear 7 elections in 3 years. Since elections are, a milestone of democracy, does it signal a healthy or an unhealthy situation? In Bulgarian circumstances, it's more of an unhealthy one to a large extent. But I also do think there are some positive trends we need to hold on to, and we can get to them later. The most general thing we can say about the context, it goes back to 3 years ago in 2021 when this cycle started. There were huge perception that things are developing, but they're not developing as fast as they should, and things are reforming, but not in depth, and they're not reforming fast enough. So in a sense that we're not really catching up with the vision of a European country that we might have had when joining some coming up to 20 years ago now. So this gave the start of this process and political instability. And then given the volatility of the electoral map of Bulgaria, meaning that new parties enter parliament at every single election, and the inability of the actors, new or old, to form a stable government that can last longer than an internship, as I've come to say recently, because it spans between 3 to 9 months, the longest we've had, unfortunately. So this inability to form a cabinet has become the reason that we're in this crisis. And this is more like the technical explanation. I think the other nuance to this is the fact that Bulgaria is on the verge of having to choose its foreign policy and value identity in a European Union which is challenged by a war in Ukraine, but also a number of world crises. We also have the stalling of the European integration and the fact that the European funds towards newer members did not lead to the reforms, especially in the judicial system, that might have been expected. So I think within these aspects of the political context, Bulgaria is facing this choice, which way to go. There are pro-Russian forces and more pro-European forces. And underneath all of this is this choice and the fight between these two sort of camps.
So were these the major issues during the election campaign? Which path Bulgaria would go, or there were also some other important election issues?
I think that having had 7 elections for the national parliament, also we had the European elections, 2 rounds of national elections and 2 rounds of presidential elections. That takes us to something like 12 ballots that we've casted in these 3 years. So apart from voter fatigue, I think there's also a party elite fatigue in the way that there's only so many issues you can campaign about within a year in 2 rounds of elections like it is this year. I think it was more low-key than before, not that many newer issues, very little emphasis on policies. So I think the main focus was whether there will be a formation of a government who can, combine with whom in terms of a coalition and a possible constellation. So nothing too major, but of course the pro-European path was emphasized by the pro-reformist forces. And also Schengen and the euro are milestones that we're aiming for. There are some issues with reaching them to do with the instability, but also not, too much consolidated support in the population for them. So they are there as topics, but they're no longer enough to provide a vision or a direction or goals that we really need to reach. So from this point of view, I would say that the election wasn't, it didn't signal too many new directions or policies or articulations of the actors.
And you mentioned about the fatigue, but still, there was, I think, 38% the turnout was in this election. Still, it was higher than in the last one, I think, for 4%. So, can you just a bit tell us about the results and maybe about the vote? Are there any voting patterns? Who is like socially or geographically who is supporting whom? Are there any patterns?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. So the majority of pro-European, pro-democratic voters are concentrated in the bigger cities. This is like something that we've seen in other elections, and it's been consolidated over time. So those with more pro-European are more urban. In the more rural areas, there is support for both smaller parties and also not so consolidated on their European path. So this is one thing. The other thing is that unfortunately younger people vote less, and overall we don't really see an increase regardless of the turnout directions of younger people voting. We do have votes that come in from abroad. They're usually awaited with a lot of anticipation before the results. So on the one hand, we have the Bulgarian diaspora, which is worldwide and within Europe. Quite a lot of this diaspora votes for more radical right or newer parties. That happens quite often. And then we also have the diaspora in Turkey, which consists of a part of the Bulgarian population of Turkish descent that was expelled by the Communist Party and nationalist policies towards the 80s, so towards the end of the communist regime. And they remain engaged in Bulgarian politics, and they support what used to be a consolidated party, which has now split for reasons we can discuss. So these are the two trends that remain strong. And also, I would say that unfortunately, the political parties are not really they're not being very consistent in following up the choices of voters when it comes to the party lists, because in Bulgaria we have proportional representation, but there's also the opportunity for preferential voting. So this means that the list is closed, but it can be reordered depending on the support a certain candidate gets. The threshold for this is 7%. So they get support, but then on the next election, let's say they're no longer in the list, or they're actually, this is not reflected in like a higher position they take. So I think that this is inconsistency is something that causes frustration amongst voters. And of course, unfortunately, we continue to have problems with the controlled vote and the buying of votes. And not enough, not just not enough. It's blatant absence of the security forces and the prosecution service that has to deal with these signals and journalistic investigations that show these things. And this contributes to the feeling of injustice and also this apathy, because why should I give my vote if someone else's vote is being paid for and others don't care? So I would say that this is a trend that remains. I think the good thing in all of this is that it keeps coming up from the bottom to the top. So now it's much harder to hide these things. Maybe they're not, no justice is served for them just yet, but then also they're harder to hide. So at least they're out in the public. And I think that this at least feeds into some sort of civic engagement and an understanding that there are things we need to deal with. It's not just votes, parties, topics, and so on. Justice is at the bottom of all these problems.
You mentioned diaspora voting. So how the votes are counted?
You mean how is their support distributed?
Yes, because you mentioned you have a proportional system. Is whole Bulgaria one electoral unit or divided? So where these diaspora votes are counted?
So they go straight to the supported parties. There have been a lot of conversation about another change in the electoral code. This happens quite often, unfortunately, and the OSCE has criticized Bulgaria a number of times for this kind of last-minute electoral changes before an upcoming election. So one of the conversations there is whether the abroad should be a separate electoral district. For now, this hasn't changed. So yeah, no major changes there. But again, they're awaited with a lot of anticipation, but they don't provide a separate MP seat as it would be if there was a separate district.
Great. So maybe now we can go to the election results, and at the end, how many parties entered? It was between 7 and 9 just a few days ago after the elections. And you mentioned also Turkish national minority. So what is the importance of their split? And I think if we add these two now parties, they won more votes than the single party won before in previous elections. So it was very controversial because the party was taken over by one of the tycoons. So maybe you can say a few words about that situation.
Sure. So now we have 8 political parties in parliament. We've gotten used to having a very multi-party system and representation. We again have a new party entering that wasn't in any previous parliament, and we have the one that entered all of a sudden in the last election. Now it's out of parliament, so this gives you an idea of how unpredictable or how predictable is the unpredictability, I suppose. So we have 8 parties, and the main thing behind sort of the profile of the current or the upcoming parliament is it's very hard to foresee any coalitions based on values or policies because it's very fragmented. The split in the so-called Turkish minority party, so this is called it used to be the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. The MRF is part of ALDE and has been, incorporated in at different levels of the leadership of ALDE, including over the years. It stands within the liberal spectrum of Bulgarian politics, and this is kind of like on the outside. And it also represents the interests and votes of those populations that were expelled by the communist regime who went to Turkey, but also those that stayed but are from these communities. Unfortunately, the truth about this party is that it not only aims to represent these interests, it doesn't represent them fully, let's say, because it has come to represent what in political science we call a cartel party, so economically very deeply ingrained in processes that are not compatible with the principles of a free market. I think I could put it this way. So a lot of corruption and big economic interests, including Russian projects and Russian-supported projects and money, have been associated with this party, including the bankruptcy of a very big bank, what comes to be now 10 years ago, and a lot of state resources that have changed hands, although this party has actually never really been in power apart from being in a coalition government more than 10 years ago now. So they've come to be this insurmountable factor for parliamentary support, and then they could change sides because never in government, somewhat in opposition, but also they provide the necessary votes for certain bigger projects or legislative initiatives. Because of this sort of corrupted side of this party, they have a member who has been sanctioned by the International Magnitsky Act, both by the United States and Great Britain, and he climbed to a very high position, the highest, one of the highest possible in the parties, as a co-president of the party. And after he was sanctioned, and then having been really outside of the political eye and publicity, he suddenly started being very active and visible in political life, which some analysts attribute to the fact that he wants to like clean his name and help himself progress in politics beyond these accusations or the Magnitsky Act situation. And the truth is that he became, and I quote here the other sort of main person in this party, Ahmed Dugan, he became a phenomenon because he's a political animal that continues to, change positions in a way that it endangers the other political actors, but also consolidates his own position. And this led to a split within the political party because it is no longer seen as authentic. It's only seen as, power hungry. And I say again, the MRF, it's not like they've never been power hungry. Every political party is. That's its purpose. But it has become completely intransparent. And also the amount of influence and the scope of the influence that the circle around MRF and concretely this Magnitsky sanctioned Delampevsky is his name person, the amount of influence they have in the judicial system has really surfaced through a number of high corruption and high how would I say it, of high public importance cases that have never been prosecuted. So we all know, but the prosecution service doesn't do anything. And a lot of these processes are blocked by the dependency of high positioned magistrates in the judicial system to the MRF and concretely the circle around Delampevsky. But this Magnitsky deal is not the only problem of the MRF. So there are a lot of speculations and reports that a lot of vote buying went on. I don't have the consolidated evidence report of this. It will be analyzed in the future by experts, but it is true that there is a strong sense that this fraction of the MRF has made its way into parliament in the second way, if I can put it in parentheses. And unfortunately, it will continue to be a kingmaker in parliament despite its lower fraction of seats because of these dependencies I talked about, both judicially and in terms of economic projects and resources.
And I think it might be interesting for our viewers also, you mentioned this Russian financial involvement. So how high it was I would say, important Russian interference into the elections? And is it the cause of the rise of the pro-Russian and the far-right parties in Bulgaria?
I would say two things. Yes, and yes, but the truth is that Russian influence in Bulgaria is not something new. So if Cambridge Analytica was a scandal in Western Europe that shocked the world, the truth is that Russian interference and disinformation and manipulation of historical myths, including, have been a part of the political landscape in our region for decades. So I wouldn't say that there is as direct Russian influence, or at least in my opinion, as it has been in Georgia and Moldova in the last few days. But here it's more mild, but also more widespread. So you have a number of political actors that project Russian interests politically, including the radical right, for sure. And the fact that the media environment is extremely it doesn't really have a strong filter when it comes to disinformation, including when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but also the positions of Russia and its true interests in the region. This allows for what is the word when you cannot sanction something, imputability maybe, of these narratives and disinformation that just is out there and is not challenged, so there's no alternative. So I would say it's more like a flavor that we have in almost anything rather than in a particular region or only a party that this influence comes from. And also in terms of the institutional side of this influence, the secret services that emerged or they never fully transformed from at the end of the totalitarian regime in Bulgaria. So a lot of this infiltration has come through these circles, and they have never been reformed, and there is very little political will to reform them. So on an institutional level, it is there. There has been quite a few instances like the Skripal case, and also the Czech arms factory that was it had an explosion a few years ago. We've had similar cases in Bulgaria, including a big arms dealer that sent his evidence abroad and found out that he was poisoned by Novichok, by a derivative of Novichok. And these are things that happen in Bulgaria, but they're not taken up on an institutional and more judicial level, let's say. So this influence is there. Many actors within different economic sectors are there, energy being only one of them. So I would say mainly this is, so the media, the political actors, and the economy, but they've been there for a long time with little alternative.
So taking into account this continuing fragmentation, on parliament and political spectrum. So what are the most realistic scenarios, the post-election scenarios? And whether you mentioned that in the beginning of our conversation that Bulgaria should take some important decisions about the direction. So will we have a new government? What kind of government? Whether that government would have such a capacity to take such important decisions, and whether there's some changes both in internal and foreign policy could be expected, or we'll have another internship long government.
Okay, so I think that whatever happens from here would be down to a huge compromise. So whoever it is from the main forces that maybe can encircle themselves with some sort of support in parliament, they will have to make huge compromises. So now this Magnitsky wing of the Turkish Minority Party will remain strong because, as I said, they don't have the same parliamentary weight as others, but they have other leverage through the judicial system, which basically also means that if there is somebody in political life who is, who should be taken out of the scene, immediately the prosecution service starts finding evidence against them. So this is really the diamond in this influence. So it cannot really be traced physically. Yeah, so it cannot really be traced physically in a way. So the expectation is that the center-right and at least discursively pro-European GERB party will again try to get the pro-reformist coalition to form a government. They have a long history now in these 3 years of not meeting each other's expectations, to put it mildly. And then one of the examples I can give, which is before this period, but either way, the GERB government was involved or allowed the building of a gas stream that passes through Bulgaria. It doesn't have access to it, but this is one of the ways that Russia managed to surpass the gas routes in a way that allows it to leave Ukraine in a more vulnerable position. So I think the main cleavage lines, shall we say, would be again the anti-corruption, the pro-European path of Bulgaria. It is very hard for the center-right to be solid on reforms because of the dependency it has, and I already mentioned regarding the judicial system. So it will be a case of compromise. So whether they risk it and they go pro-reform, which will have a very high price, or they continue to dribble the ball as in a basketball game and then pretend they're kind of moving on Schengen or the Eurozone, but not really dealing with the internal problems. Any external shocks can have an influence on this. We see that the Middle East is extremely volatile, and we have the war in Ukraine still at I don't even know how to call it, but I guess it's somewhat of a standstill for now. So these will be big reasons until they become catalysts. So they won't be leading, but they will be taken into account of any upcoming government.
And they probably, like we all keep an eye on the U.S. election, probably that will also have an impact on Bulgaria.
Yes, we only have like 4 days in the
Yes.
world we live in right now, and it's about to change one way or another. So yeah, the U.S. elections will have a major impact on world politics, but for the region, absolutely, because anything that happens in Ukraine has major implications for the politics of Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, the Balkans, and beyond. And in countries like mine, where democratic resilience is it's still being tested, the truth is. And the state of opposition, they say it's usually shows you the state of democracy overall. We cannot even get to the point of having an opposition because we cannot form a government. So these things will also play out, but we hope for the best always, and we continue to fight for democratic values daily.
Thank you. I think it's a perfect way to conclude this conversation. Thank you, Mila, very much for your deep insights on Bulgarian politics. Thank you again.
Thank you as well.